Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on Sri Lanka's economic depression and the IMF that Kuppi has organized. There's a lot of talk about this, but we still have a number of questions, which is why we thought we will organize this discussion. So many things are up in the air. Most of all, we're wondering about the impact this will have on people, on public resources, etc. For those of you who joined us today but don't know what or who Kuppi is, we are a group of academics who came together a few years back to think and write on higher education and other things that relate to it in the country. We write to the newspapers in all three languages, and we've had several public discussions also on different topics. So at today's discussion on the IMF and economic shifts that may happen, we have two speakers, both from departments of sociology. Professor Farzana Haniffa is at the University of Colombo. She will talk about social and political concerns related to the IMF agreements. Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar is from the University of Jaffna, and he will talk of economic ramifications of the policies that we may have to agree to. Professor Haniffa will speak first, and then Dr. Kadirgamar. We will keep it to 15 minutes of contribution from both, and so that after that we will move on to a Q&A, and we want to keep as much time for the Q&A as possible. So I invite you to add questions to the chat if you don't do it till both Professor Haniffa and Dr. Kadirgamar have stopped speaking, but afterwards, of course, we can all raise questions. Farah, you can start.
Thank you, Kaushi. Yeah. So good afternoon. I am actually going to start with a disclaimer, which is that I really am not an expert on anything to do with the IMF, and I barely understand sort of economic thinking. So my perspective, I actually feel like I should have had some training in economics, or I should have had some training in constitutional law to be able to actually understand and sort of like get a grasp of what is going on in our country right now. But unfortunately, I don't. But I feel like I may have something of interest to say, only because I think I am also preoccupied by some of the anxieties that Kaushalya also mentioned in terms of what is happening to us and what is going to be the plight of our day-to-day lives for the next few months, maybe years. So, mine, in terms of a discussion about the IMF, it will only be very tangential in terms of what we are experiencing now and how we can think about our reality. Okay, so now I will start by talking a little bit about, what kinds of anxieties preoccupy me. Now, how soon will we feel the consequence of the medicine shortage? How long before we hear the numbers of patients beginning to die due to the shortage of medicines? Shortages of medicines of very standard procedures, very standard things that you can treat better from. People are starting to die. Now, we know that groups are organizing to privately source and bring down medicines, which seems a very impractical and a very scaled down process. And I'm not sure to what extent it will have any kind of significant coverage. Now, I am waiting for someone to tell me that the bridge financing will be coming soon and these issues will be sorted. But no one is really saying that yet. Now, as government servants, we are currently cushioned by our steady and relatively high income. But what will our money be worth in 6 months? As for our spouses who are not government servants, will they even continue to have jobs? As the middle class, as part of the middle class, quite privileged middle class, my experience currently of the crisis has been the absence of butter and milk products on supermarket shelves, giving up on eating at restaurants or ordering off the delivery apps. We can still afford most groceries that supermarkets continue to stock. And therefore, what is most troubling is the uncertainty of what is going to happen in the next few months. Now, at the university, we continue to function as per normal, quote unquote. newly recruited young colleagues who travel from distances, over 2 hours travel from their homes to Colombo, have asked if something could be done. There are no buses sometimes, and a trishaw ride costs over 1,000 one way. The canteens don't function, so an Ubered lunch is more than 500 rupees. Some other young colleagues, permanent lecturers, have said they can barely afford to come to work because their fuel bill for the month is now 30% of their salary. We are facing a severe paper shortage, but have just enough for on-site exams in May. We are compelling all students at Colombo, 4,000 something of them, to come for their exams on-site. We want to have on-site after almost 2 years of online exams that really didn't go that well. But there is this fuel issue. So we are providing everyone hostel facilities and hoping that that will circumvent the fuel issue. Now, we are planning international conferences. We are sending out calls for papers. We are discussing building plans. All of this as everything kind of starts to crumble around us. Now, at the national level, we are being told that we won't be able to sustain food production due to the damage to our agriculture recently. And if we are unable to import food, we will have shortages and almost famine conditions. Now, a friend who recently traveled to villages in Anuradhapura stated that there are no livelihoods in the villages, but at least they may be able to survive because of some cultivation. Now, we have an education system that was crippled for 2 years due to COVID. We have not done anything to even think about recovery from that experience. And we are now facing a paper shortage and can't have exams. The protests. Now, the protests are probably the only arena where there is some hope, some sanity, and some energy, and the feeling that we are taking some action against the utter depravity of a ruling elite whom we watched as they brought us to this point. Now, as I write these sentences, I know that there are deeper reasons for the crisis that are not reducible to the actions of these elites. I'm in support of the intellectuals, and especially Ahilan, actually, who says that we are not to think of this crisis as brought about only through the mind-boggling greed, hubris, and incompetence of the Rajapaksas, but as something that was only compounded by their actions. I'm sympathetic with such a reading, and the critique of the neoliberal policy path that we have traveled is essential for our journey towards any future that we can take charge of. However, I think it is essential that we are given this time to shout and scream slogans and express our anger. I think it is also important that we recognize that we are gathering and shouting not just at the fact that we are stressed by the economic burden and the many uncertainties that we are faced with, but also because we have finally had enough of the window dressing and the whitewashing and the gaslighting and the eyewash that the entire population was subjected to during the reign of the Rajapaksas. It is essential that all the many far more profound grievances that we have, from the loved ones of those who were killed during the Easter bombings, to the families that disappeared in both the North and the South, families and colleagues of journalists who were killed, then other larger groups like upcountry communities marginalized for generations, and the many, many, many others who are shouting, "Gota, go home." It is important that they are given the space to do so. The university students' unions, the middle class youth who are credited with starting the protests, the lawyers who have come out to do so much pro bono work, and everyone else who has been energized and politicized by this moment, it is important that we are permitted to call out the leaders who have failed us. And the failure, as I said, is not just of this moment, but it's a failure that has been coming for a really, really long time. Now, as a person working with issues concerning the Muslim community, now I was privy to how the manipulation of the Rajapaksa regime brought about the anti-Muslim movement and the events of Alutkama and Digana and the deaths of the Easter bombings, but also most recently the forced cremations and the criminalization of everything that is Muslim. But I have also witnessed the Muslim middle class and their inability to comprehend what has happened to them. as a result of this anti-Muslim movement, and unable, therefore, to understand how best to deal with the problem. At times, we were fighting with each other, and how our various practices triggered Sinhala responses, not with the racism of the media and the regime. The toxicity of that racism that we lived with for years resulted in us turning on one another. So the playing of the call of prayer at Golface, the iftars, niqab-wearing women moving freely on their own are significant. Of the clips circulating on social media, one of my favorite was of a niqab-wearing woman screaming insults at the president in a high-pitched and particularly dissonant voice and leading a political chant. So there must be thousands of stories just like that. When I'm at the protests, either with friends, with colleagues, or with my children, I look out and try to find the odd individual protesters standing alone. And there are always many to be found. There are crowds of young people, there are crowds of groups who've come together, but there are also always one or two individuals standing alone, compelled to be there, holding their placards. So we must celebrate this moment of protest and amplify its possibilities. But of course, just yesterday, we were a hugely fractious polity with many, many fault lines. So those cracks are appearing in the protest arena already. Now, the responses to Ambika Satgunanathan's incisive tweets, for instance, from people ostensibly protesting, has been interesting. A young lawyer called her a racist and alluded that there were many such racists who prevented minorities from joining the Sinhalese and who profited from such a position. Then more recently, a war hero's tent came up in Golface, and then there were chants stating that the military and the police were all ape lamai, our children. Those who were critical of the state's use of the military and the police to carry out violence against civilian populations, minorities, and the marginalized, and those who saw them as complicit in human rights abuses were not happy with this. Then slightly more benign perhaps, but very significant, was the choral group that sang a song from the musical Les Mis, Can You Hear the People Sing, and forgot to sing the national anthem in Tamil. Then there was a set of suggestions for solutions put up at Kadirgamar that called for one country, one law, without critiquing the manner in which this same slogan was used to pathologize Muslims. And no one is saying, don't go to the IMF. Protesters are saying, go to the IMF as soon as possible. So we are preoccupied today with two main concerns. How do we get out of the economic crisis so that the gas and petrol lines and the power cuts may cease and we can start to address the economic woes that they represent? And the second, what is the solution to the political crisis? Can we get the Rajapaksas out? Now, those of us who want, not those of us, but those who want us to go to the IMF are under the impression that that is the only option to somehow ease the dollar shortage and the knock-on effect that is slowly killing our economy. We are being told that since we are resilient, we should be back on our feet in 6 months or so. But more critical economic analysis seems to show that this is really unlikely. We are in this crisis for the long haul, it seems, and there are no short-term solutions, no shortcuts to relief. While going to the IMF seems inevitable, there is not enough information about what that process will do. So just before I came for this presentation, I read Indi Samarajiva's article, I think in the Daily Mirror today, that referenced some writing by Daniel Alphonsus. In that article, they say that in the short term, our lives become barely tolerable. And as I was reading the article, I heard from my husband that electricity was going to be increased by 100%. So what is being said in that article is scary, and the solutions to our problems is not in the short term, not in 6 months, but long term. We have to re-engineer our economy to ensure that we have industries that produce for export and that we are not caught out once again in this trap against the dollar, and we must ensure that our food production is safe. Now we are being told instead by, for instance, I was listening to Harsha De Silva, we are being told that this is an old notion, that we must not shut ourselves away from the world, that we should get with the program and engage with the global economy. While that is all well and good, we need to think about our priorities and ensure that we engage with the global economy on our own terms as much as possible. What is our requirement? To look modern or ensure that our population does not starve, that we have services that are attractive to foreign tourists that may or may not come, or that we have a functional state-funded education system. Do we ensure that we have the ability to consume in a manner that is on par with the rest of the world, or that we have utilities that everyone can afford? Basically, do we have an economy that is in touch with the world that permit a few to do well at the expense of the larger populace? Or do we practice old-fashioned controls to ensure that we have a healthy population which has access to a decent education and some social support? So this seems to be what we are arguing about when we are talking about the IMF going to save us and the IMF not going to save us. Now, for me, it seems clear that with or without the IMF, we are in this again for the long haul, that the deprivation that we are suffering now is going to continue and possibly get worse, that the raising of the fuel price, the raising of the electricity is going to cripple our businesses, and that we are going to have an increase in poverty and a loss of food security, right? And difficult lives for a majority of our population. Now, what has been most useful for me in thinking through what we are experiencing and what we seem to be set to experience for the long term are the historical moments where we have had this kind of difficulty before. I'm old enough to remember the 70s and the early 80s. But my memories of that time of deprivation are of a gloriously happy childhood surrounded by relatives, not of deprivation. More recently, in conversations about the hard times that are slowly coming upon us, we were reminded of people of the North who went through much harder times, and not so long ago. The years without electricity and very low supplies of food rations were survived. Now, then reading up this morning on the Anthropology of Austerity, there were many scary and negative accounts, but all the positive stories are of communities coming together. So having said that, I think it is also important to remember the political context of those times. The political authoritarianism that was ongoing at that time or immediately followed. Of course, we need a reassessment of our way of life, our patterns of consumption, our goals and our priorities, and how we conceptualize a future for the country and our children need to be rethought. The point of our neoliberal system is that there is so much to do, forms to fill, paperwork to complete, rubrics to formulate, and as Shamala had written today, quality to assure, that we have no time to think, no time to connect with one another, no time to ponder on anything that will not be considered productive. Now, amidst the power cuts that force us to suspend our productive activities and the fuel lines in which we are forced to sit, not doing anything, maybe we can ponder some of these questions. Maybe we can come up with solutions that are not stripped away from us in this race that we are in right now. Now, I do not mean to suggest, of course, that the fuel line that I will wait in my car purchase with my car permit is the same fuel line that the three-wheeler driver waits to ensure a day's livelihood. His wait is much more fraught than mine. The shortage of butter in the supermarket that bothers me is not the same as the 1 meal a day, if that, of many families even today. And that, I think, is the reality that we are inadequately accounting for when we are waiting for the IMF. If people are protesting at fuel lines today, how are they going to be protesting at the 100% price hike of electricity announced just now? Austerity measures have always resulted in the bringing of authoritarian populists to power. At this moment, when we are already celebrating the imminent departure of one set of authoritarian rulers, why are we consenting to the conditions that will surely bring about another? I am asking that we brace ourselves for what is to come, or rather, what is already upon us, and use it as an opportunity to re-engineer our way of life. We would be wrong to think of it as a brief hump that we need to get over in order to get back to the way things were only a few months ago. We have to think and ponder and plan, but I think most importantly, we need to fight. We need to fight back against these truths that are being foisted on us as the only solutions, the only relief, and the 6-month or so period of hardship. That is not the real story. And I think it's time that we were better informed about what that real story might be and fight back. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Ahilan will speak now, and after that we take questions.
Thank you, Kaushi. And I think Farah has really grounded this discussion in very concrete terms about what people are going through, what we need to ponder, what alternatives we need to struggle for. So I think I can be brief here today. Much of what I want to say, Farah has really kind of given it in very grounded terms. I want to do 3 things here. 1, what kind of a crisis is this? 2, what does it mean to go to the IMF? And 3, what kind of alternatives can we start thinking about? So I think this event by our collective is really meant to start a discussion, as Farah said, and get us to ponder and for all of us to reflect collectively together. I don't think there are any right answers here. So that's how we hope to take this discussion forward today. So first, what is this crisis? There is a sense among people that somehow this is a short crisis. Somehow, as Farah said, in 6 months' time, we'll be back to where we started, possibly 3 years ago before the pandemic. But I think that is a very short-sighted assumption about what we are facing. This is not a short crisis. My sense is that this is going to be a lost decade like the crisis that Greece went through. Now, economists talk about crisis. They use the term recessions. What is an economic recession? An economic recession is when there are 2 consecutive quarters of a reduction in economic growth, or when there's no economic growth, but rather the economy is shrinking for 2 consecutive quarters. If you look at the data, 2020, quarter 1 and quarter 2, when the pandemic hit, we were in a recession. But there's very little discussion now of what an economic depression is. An economic depression, like the one in the 1930s, is when you have years of economic turmoil and years when the economy can almost go into a kind of a tailspin. So that is what, in a sense, I would argue we are going through. We are seeing a disruption of the economic system itself. And so what are the dynamics of this disruption or this crisis? And I want to say here, the reason why this is also not getting much attention is because mainstream economics or neoclassical economics, or I would argue even the economic discipline itself, does not have a theory of crises. Therefore, they are not able to understand the dynamics of such crises. It is the Marxists who have always talked about crisis and attempted to theorize crisis, and often not fully. But in mainstream economics, there is no sense of analyzing the crisis because it's always assumed that somehow the markets will clear and the markets will get us out of this. So at heart are there fundamental assumptions about the market that does not allow them to analyze what I'm calling an economic depression or an economic, a serious economic crisis. Now, what would be those dynamics? One, in such a depression, the economy will go into tailspin. In other words, the various factors at work in the economy will reinforce each other towards continuous decline in the economy. So private actors, including the private sector, won't produce because there is no prospect of profit. And if there's no prospect of profit, with the kind of inflation that we are seeing, the kind of cost of capital that we are seeing, then they won't produce. They will start to reduce their production. Not only that, consumers won't be able to, can't consume because their wages are declining. And when they don't consume, the demand for the production of the producers will decline. And on top of that, if the state also decides to carry forward austerity policies, the demand that only the state can create, taking the risk, also taking on board the losses, that demand will also be reduced. So these kinds of multiple factors at work is what pushes the economy into a tailspin, and it can be very prolonged. The global situation at the current moment is also not conducive. The Federal Reserve and the various central banks are on the path of increasing interest rates. So it makes the cost of capital that much more expensive. And global commodity markets are seeing huge price hikes, partly due to the war in Ukraine, but this has been a trend for a number of years now. So all of those factors together are pushing us into a depression, that there has to be some major shift in policies, some major ways of pulling a country like Sri Lanka out of this depression, but we are not seeing any of that. And amidst this sort of fall in production, what I'm really worried about is what's going to happen to our food system. Because what is really worrying is the food crisis that people are meeting, and that could mean that we have starvation or famine type of conditions. Already over the last 4 decades, we have become much more dependent on imports for foods. But now, particularly the last 2 years, the fertilizer ban, in a sense, was like shooting a moving vehicle that was running at 100 kilometers per hour. The tires have blasted, and now the truck itself has crashed. And if we think if we can just change the tires, somehow we get the fertilizers back and everything will be back to normal, I think that's a big mistake. Farmers have started to lose confidence in agriculture because they're not getting the incomes. And therefore, how are we going to get ourselves, without a huge mobilization towards food production, we won't be able to get this vehicle moving again. And I think that has to be a priority. Now I'll come to the second point about the IMF agreement and the call for an IMF agreement. And I want to say that it's no longer a question about, are we going to the IMF or not? We already have gone to the IMF, not just in terms of starting negotiations, but implementing their recommendations. We have floated the rupee and transferred the cost of floating that rupee to the consumers. Bread prices have doubled. So have petrol prices. Now, that was one of their main recommendations. They have said that we should address inflation, though I think inflation is the wrong concept to use in terms of what we are seeing. These are price hikes. This is not about the economy heating up and therefore prices increasing, wages are increasing. Wages have not increased. Prices of certain imported commodities and prices of commodities that use imported inputs have dramatically risen. And they want us to raise interest rates, which we have more than doubled the interest rates from 6% to 14%. And when the central bank sets the interest rates at 14%, the borrowing costs of consumers, of small businesses, of farmers, they are going to possibly increase much more than that, from 20 to 30%. Businesses that require overdraft facilities might end up paying something like 30%. And this is on the further path of rising. So when that happens, what we will see, inflation is not going to necessarily decline. What we are going to see is that small businesses, small-time producers, they are going to find that they are not able to produce, or their businesses are going to collapse. And that's what normally happens during a depression. Those of us who are from the left are often critical of businesses and the profits that they make. But during a depression like this, what we are going to see is mass bankruptcies of small businesses, which is also going to then add to the higher and higher levels of unemployment and the fall in livelihoods. Another recommendation that the IMF has said, and you'll probably see this being implemented in the days or weeks ahead, is to increase taxes. But what kind of taxes are going to be increased? Is it going to be the VAT, which leads to a further burden and further reduction in the purchasing power of people? Or is it going to be, second, let me get my cat out of here. Is it going to be further reduction in the consumption capacity of people? Is it going to further increase the burden on people? This idea that the IMF is somehow a magic bullet. We've already gone through 16 IMF agreements, the most recent one in 2016, before that in 2009. This time around, we might be going for multiple IMF agreements and much more sooner. So let's not kid ourselves that somehow going to this IMF this time is going to solve our crisis. It's for us to figure out how we are going to deal with this. The third point I want to put forward, and this is really a discussion for all of us to have together, is what are the alternatives? What should we be doing in the short term? What can we think about in terms of the medium and longer term? In the short term, as I mentioned, I think we really have to focus on our food system. Because if people are starving, everything else to me is meaningless. How are we going to ensure there's enough food production? What kind of a food production drive are we going to have? The government doesn't seem to have a clue. How are we going to prioritize food imports, essential imports? It might be oil, it might be medicines, it might be goods for production and even exports. I think the state has to take control of that. Otherwise, there will be no prioritization. If you let private actors do that, they're going to go where the margin is. They're going to hold the goods, even if they have it in supply, because they're going to wait till they can make a profit. That is just the logic of capitalism. So we need the state to take control of imports. We have to have a public distribution system where the state ensures that the goods reach where it's needed. The market in a time of depression is going to work in tailspin. It's not going to help bring things back to normal. It is going to be a reinforcing force in the tailspin of further disruption. And where are we going to, and particularly when we are in a depression, when people don't have the capacity to, the purchasing power, there have to be subsidies, there has to be relief. But the question will come up, where are we going to find the revenues for such subsidies? I have been arguing, and this has been continuously falling on deaf ears, that this is not the time to increase the VAT. It's possibly not even the time to increase income taxes, because incomes are also falling, that we have to draw on the accumulated wealth. And of course, that accumulated wealth has been in greatly unequal terms. We have to dig into that accumulated wealth and distribute it through a wealth tax, through forms of subsidies to get people to be able to consume. In the medium term, we really have to start changing our priorities. We have to think in terms of self-sufficiency. The logic over the last 4.5 decades has been that if we let the market work, if we liberalize our markets, if we liberalize trade, that this would lead to prosperity. And I think we are a great example of how this is not the case. And we have to get our priorities right in terms of at least ensuring we are self-sufficient to the extent that we can in the products where we can be self-sufficient. And we have to move away from a complete dependency in the global market. Next, we have to build up on our strengths, which means a focus on social welfare. So those, I would say, we need to start a discussion, even as we are trying to fight this crisis in the very short term, our immediate concerns, start to think about the medium term in terms of self-sufficiency and a focus on social welfare. Our longer term policies have to really fundamentally rethink financial and trade liberalization, which are at the core of the crisis. We were the first to liberalize trade and finance. Of course, capitalism goes through crisis. We are going to see much of the crisis that we are seeing in Sri Lanka also affect many other parts of the world. We started early. We have been hit with a crisis much more earlier as well. And as the world goes into crisis, as the global order unravels, we really have to rethink these policies of trade and financial liberalization, and even question some of the sectoral priorities, this focus on tourism that Farah mentioned. What are we going to invest in for the long term? We've seen that the last 13 odd years after the war of investment in infrastructure, very heavy infrastructure, the highways and so on, are not giving us the returns. We have seen that a focus on export-oriented food production has actually undermined our own food security. We need to fundamentally start rethinking these priorities and think of a different kind of global order that is now emerging. And how are we going to trade with other countries? What kind of global economic relations are we going to have, even as we think about the priorities that we're going to focus on? Thank you.